Yeah, hey everybody, I'm Nate Prier, local president for Cape 508 at ICED. Bienvenue tout le monde. Je suis Nate Prier, je suis le président des sections locales d'ACEP 508 à ISDE. I just wanted to welcome everyone to what we hope is going to be a productive discussion about what we're going to kind of collectively do about this glaring issue of telework that all of us in Cape are facing to one degree or another. Before we begin, I just want to ask everyone to please mute themselves. I will be actively muting you during Adam's presentation, but just if you could do that beforehand. And I also just want to first acknowledge that we in the National Capital Region, at least, are gathered on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation territory, which on the Ontario side, at least, is currently in the process of being very sketchily, legally, quote unquote, ceded without the consent of the Algonquin leadership. And I encourage all members to kind of follow the modern treaty process that's underway here, to listen to Anishinaabe Algonquin community members on their ongoing stewardship of these lands, and to think kind of critically about how Crown entities such as the City of Ottawa execute things like development deals on stolen lands with often very questionable Indigenous consultation tactics. Gardez également un œil sur les appels à la solidarité active concernant les questions telles que le moratoire sur la chasse à l'orignal et les interdictions d'exploitation forestière sur le territoire Anishinaabe-Algonquin, qui impliquent souvent d'importants efforts de solidarité de la part des résidents non autochtones de ces terres. All right, and just to do some kind of housekeeping beforehand, I want to encourage everyone who hasn't yet to sign up for the Cape Solidarity Caucus, which, if you don't know, is the rank and file caucus that's open to all Cape members. That's created, in my opinion at least, a pretty awesome interdepartmental discussion and action space that's already making some big democratic ripples in our union. And the space is super encouraging. It'll help us to have some serious discussions, and more importantly, I think, plan out some paths of action about the future of our workplace in ways that the current union doesn't really lend itself well to. So make sure, I'm just going to grab the link here, make sure to sign up for the Solidarity Caucus through this form that I am right now putting in the chat. Once I find the chat, there we go. That'll get you signed up. All right. And so the caucus is currently finalizing its telework campaign plans. We had a big meeting last week. And where the steering committee is currently finalizing a plan of action that we hope will kind of dramatically improve outcomes for members that are seeking telework. And then more importantly, and I think more kind of definitively, get us in a strong position for the next round of bargaining, which is going to be getting underway a lot sooner than a lot of you might think, because we just signed a CA, but we were backlogging that contract. So we'll be kind of prepping for bargaining in about a year and a half-ish time. Et juste pour ces sessions, je veux dire que Adam, il va présenter en anglais, mais pour les questions et réponses, on peut le faire bilinguement si quelqu'un veut parler en français. Soyez sûr de la faire. Et moi, je peux traduire si Adam a de la misère à comprendre. Mais before we get into, the telework campaign and stuff, though, let's pivot to the main act and hear from Dr. Adam King about why we should be fighting hard for telework rights in the first place. Donc, le Dr. Adam King, il est professeur adjoint en études du travail à l'Université du Manitoba. Il a reçu un doctorat en sociologie de l'Université York, où moi je l'ai rencontré. Il était auparavant chercheur principal en politique sociale et économique au Congrès du travail du Canada. Et il rédige le bulletin syndical hebdomadaire Class Struggle, une publication qui s'appelle The Maple. So, without further ado, Adam, if you want to take over.
Thanks, Nate. It's great to be with you guys today. Thanks for the invitation to what I hope is a useful and worthwhile discussion. So I'm just going to share my screen here quickly. Okay, so I'm just going to go over a few things here today, a couple of sort of kind of give you a lay of the land of what sort of the state of telework looks like in Canada, and what unions have sort of so far been able to negotiate around telework, and then highlight some of what I think are sort of the key aspects to the ongoing fight for telework rights. So just a couple of things off the top, just a note on terminology. Telework, work from home, remote work, these terms kind of get used interchangeably. and all use them interchangeably today. On the employer side, I would characterize the employer response so far to the continuation of telework post-pandemic to be somewhat mixed. If anyone regularly follows the press, or what exists as a kind of labor press in Canada, which is mostly a business press, you'd notice that there's a lot of hysteria around telework. Just today, there was a Financial Post article that came out, very much in keeping with their reporting on this, which is often quite biased toward employers, warning about the crisis of not being able to return people to the office, and managerial concerns about time theft, and being able to properly manage workers who continue to work at home, these types of things. In actual fact, there's, like I said, there's been a mixed response from employers. There certainly are many employers who have tried to end the telework experiment and get people back into the office, but there's also a share of employers who have been willing to continue work from home arrangements, but this is usually highly contingent on the workforce and the workplace in question. If the employer, for example, thinks that they can save on overhead costs and is relatively certain that they can continue to get the same productivity out of people, and the willingness to continue with work from home has been greater, but it often comes down to the individual bargaining power of the workers in question. So high-skilled workers who are hard to replace have tended to have greater bargaining power to leverage continued work from home arrangements. So what really hasn't happened all that much yet, although I will get into some of the union campaigns around it, is an exercise of collective power to win telework rights. But that is really the sort of frontier of the struggle now, moving beyond just those workers with the individual skills necessary to win a right to work from home, and really turn it into a collective good. And then there are sort of a group of employers, and this will be, of course, familiar to the folks on this call, who have not tried to fully end the telework experiment, but have moved towards some type of a hybrid model. That is, to sort of limit the amount of work from home hours and turn it into a kind of part office, part homework arrangement. And so really the question is, like, how many hours in this, or how many days per week? This is even the case across a lot of unions, actually, people who are in staff unions. So, for example, at the Canadian Labour Congress, where I was before, this has really been the model, of move away from the telework of the pandemic and toward a kind of 2 days in the office, 3 days at home, this type of arrangement. And of course, it was the Treasury Board's unilateral move to try to impose this model on federal public service workers that really turned this into a really hot button issue, and a strike issue. So Statistics Canada has been gathering data on telework and work from home arrangements for a while now, but of course, the attention to this really grew during the pandemic. So they just had a report come out just last month, I think it was, or maybe actually only a couple of weeks ago, that showed the percentage of Canadians working most of their hours from home has more than tripled since the mid-2010s, increasing from 7.4% in May 2016 to 24.3% in May of 2021. That was really the high point during the pandemic. So the StatsCan was collecting this data basically through the census before the pandemic, and then they switched to collecting it more regularly through the monthly labor force survey. So that's where this data from these two charts comes from. And just to note here, they've given you the actual value and then the predicted value. So they changed the questions essentially in January of last year, and it overestimated the number of people who are actually working from home. So the darker sort of brown line there is a more accurate picture. So yeah, we have, certainly much greater numbers of people working from home than we did 10, 15 years ago. But it has shrunk since the pandemic really put it on the radar. And the stats show, of course, that kind of what you'd expect, the larger provinces, Ontario, Quebec, and BC, but Ontario and Quebec in particular, which is what these two graphs chart, have the largest incidence of work from home. And that StatsCan study, one of the interesting things that it shows is that commuting time is likely the biggest predictor or one of the major boosters of work from home preference among workers. So even when you control for things like the feasibility of doing your job from home, when you control for those things, it tends to be commuting preference that really puts things, puts the preference for work from home higher, and then makes it more likely in Ontario, Quebec, and BC. So what have unions so far attempted to do on the issue of remote work? I have a separate project with a colleague of mine at IATSE Union, the International Alliance of Stage Theatrical Employees. He and I are working on a project that's tracking collective bargaining agreements negotiated during the pandemic. And what we're interested there is we're interested in what unions were able to do specifically related to pandemic issues. So we're tracking new provisions in collective agreements having to do with the pandemic and sort of coding them all and categorizing them. So this is just a chart from that project. And remote work, we found, is the third largest area or bargaining area during the pandemic, just behind recall and seniority rights, which was first, and pay and bonus related to the pandemic, and extended paid leaves, which tied as second. So remote work has really been a focus for those unions, at least, that bargained during the pandemic, as you might expect. Most of the provisions, however, have been negotiated as letters or memorandum of understanding. That is not included in the collective bargaining agreement itself, so similar to the telework arrangement that federal public servants managed to get out of the last round of bargaining. Now, some of these, I'll get into this in a second, some of that language is stronger, some weaker, but again, these are all letters of understanding, are time limited, right? They're outside of the collective agreement. So once that agreement expires, the letter expires as well. So this is one of the main problems with not having these rights secured in the collective agreement itself. And just a note here on this chart. So there's a lot more provisions related to remote work than there are collective agreements. So, one agreement might have several provisions related to collective work, like outlining things like when you can do it, what the criteria are for working from home, what the employer needs to cover, those types of things. And I'll show some sample language of what this looks like in the next slide. So not surprisingly, it's telework rights in collective bargaining agreements or in letters of understanding were most common in public administration jobs. This was particularly the case at the level of contracts negotiated during the pandemic secured extended telework rights for municipal public servants. But there was also remote work rights won across industries, including in the private sector, especially where there was clerical staff. So even in things like manufacturing, for example, we found examples of clerical staff winning temporary telework rights and then commitments from employers to negotiate in the future over these. And so that's another thing that needs to be highlighted, is that a lot of these provisions around remote work do commit employers to negotiate in the future over them. So they're sort of like telework rights, but they're relatively weak. They set out often some sort of committee to study it, maybe at the weakest end, or at the stronger end, a commitment on the part of employers and some group delegated by the union to set out a plan. Now, I've included example right from COPE here at TransLink in BC, this language. Some of the stronger language, they agree to a process for ensuring that workers can access telework, and then to implement it within 6 months of ratification of the agreement. So this is a letter outside of the agreement, but it commits 6 months from now to begin it, and then theoretically at least it will be part of the collective agreement in the next round. So there's a range here, right, on how strong the language is. And then among those unions that have won greater telework rights into their collective bargaining agreements, that is permanently, not as side letters, they've often accompanied those with language that protects employees from other things. So, for example, protections from overwork, which is a concern, right? That once the line between work and home gets blurred, there's a potential for, unpaid overtime or excessive working hours, those types of things. So protections against those. And also protections against employees having to bear the costs of working from home. So I included some language here from IATSE at an animation studio on the West Coast. In this case, it's sort of long language. I won't read it all, but in this case, essentially what they managed to secure there was protections from employees having to bear any of the cost of setting up a home office. So commitments from the employer to cover those costs, shipping equipment to the office, those types of things. So that's something to consider when or if when telework gets moved into the collective agreement. There's a range of things that also need to be considered, not just the right to work from home, but what working from home looks like on an ongoing basis. And I'll get into some of that in a moment. So why do telework rights matter? I think there's a number or a range of sort of ways you could frame this, or one might frame a telework campaign or a campaign to win telework rights. First of all, I mean, why it's important to have this in a collective agreement as opposed to just as a letter of understanding or something that's temporary. PSAC and federal public sector unions have secured these, relatively limited telework rights in these panels to review denials of work from home requests, which on the one hand is an important victory. It is a kind of first step. It's very limited, and it's limited for the reason that I indicated before, in that it's temporary. If it's not in the collective agreement, it is time limited for this particular agreement. When it expires, the letters expire, and you have no guarantee of an ongoing commitment. So, I mean, folks on the call maybe perhaps know more than I do, but I mean, it strikes me as, the question raises the question for me: what becomes of these panels if there's no commitment to maintain this on an ongoing basis? What stops management from effectively nixing the whole deal? If you don't have it in the collective bargaining agreement, there really isn't much force there outside the time constraints of this particular agreement. And of course, an internal grievance procedure, which is what is apparently going to operate in the federal public service, is much weaker than a formal grievance procedure because there's no ultimate path to arbitration beyond that internal process, which is also worrying, right? It leaves management ultimately as the final arbitrator of decisions, even if you have a panel that's ostensibly made up of equal parts union representatives and management. It's still, as far as the law is concerned, leaves management as the final say. So, before the PSAC strike, the union maintained that during collective bargaining, there should be a freeze on any changes to the terms and conditions of work, and that hybrid work should therefore be negotiated at the bargaining table, which was a reasonable position. It was somewhat rhetorical. The Treasury Board, on the other hand, predictably argued that it's the employer's right to determine where work takes place. Now, unions are likely to run into that argument in every telework campaign, that it is a matter of managerial rights. And as far as the law is concerned, that is technically true, but it should be remembered that all things are technically managerial rights until they're included in collective agreement. So it's all fine and well to characterize, decisions over where work takes place as a management concern, but when that's precisely why it's so important to win it as a right, because it removes it from management's unilateral decision-making power and turns it into something that workers have a say over on an ongoing basis. In this way, I mean, you can kind of think of telework rights as something similar to items over which unions fight to bargain over that are technically outside the scope of collective bargaining. So lots of unions in public sector are including things like common good demands, like teachers and nurses demanding better conditions to support students and patients, like things that are technically outside of the scope of bargaining, but once you bring them into the scope, they become something that unions can bargain over. But it's important, really, to emphasize that in order to do that, you need a high level of buy-in from your membership, right? If you're going to try and circumvent the narrow parameters of scope that labor law often puts in the way of unions, you really do need supermajority support and engagement from your membership to demonstrate that it is a very important issue to the union, and that the union is able to go, or willing to go, to great lengths to get that issue on the bargaining table and into a collective agreement. Second, there's the issue of gender justice. This, in my opinion, should be a very central part of any telework rights campaign. Women continue to shoulder the burden of caregiving work at home and in their broader communities. And the pandemic work from home experiment, in many respects, both highlighted this, but also allowed for a greater balancing of work and life, which is, survey data has shown that this was a very important aspect of the work from home experiment, if you want to call it that, during the pandemic. And so unsurprisingly, telework tends to be more popular among women than it is among men, surveys show. At the same time, while many workers reported increased free time as a result of working from home, you should also bear in mind that others experienced greater workloads, the inability to disconnect from work and increased pressure from management to perform and to be, available outside of normal working hours. So any telework rights campaign is going to have to balance those two things. On the one hand, it does open the opportunity to address work-life balance and gender inequities. On the other hand, you really do need to guard against telework becoming overwork. And we should keep in mind that some research also shows that those working outside of the office may experience disadvantages when it comes to promotions, raises, or other merit-based awards at work. So this also has the potential to exacerbate gender inequalities if it's not addressed. So any telework rights campaign that ultimately secures those rights would need to be accompanied by language that protects those working from home from being discriminated against. There is also issues of accessibility and inclusion. So telework rights can really be framed also as a disability justice issue as well. During the pandemic, several feature news articles highlighted the work opportunities that were opened for people with disabilities because of work from home policies. And I think this is likely to continue to be a feature of any successful telework rights campaign, or it should be. But again, we should also be cautious that it doesn't wind up being framed as a temporary accommodation, something that's anomalous and confined only to those with a demonstrated need. The whole point of the campaign really should be focused on a right to telework, across the board, that puts the choice on the worker's side. But nevertheless, framing full telework rights as enhancing the opportunities of workers who are disadvantaged in one way or another, I think is a good route to go down. There's also the issue of environmental concerns. So one of the primary reasons that remote work is so popular, as I pointed to before, is the elimination of commute times. This seems to be particularly the case in Canada. Remote work is actually more popular in Canada than in any other Western country that's been surveyed about it. And I think this has to also do with the fact that Canadians have on average very high commute or very long commute times. And what survey data there is shows that this is especially the case among public service union members. So it made sense to me that when Nate reached out that a federal public service union was engaging in or trying to start a telework rights campaign to secure this. It is public service union members who are most in favor of working from home. But there's a related environmental case to be made to the commuting time argument. Of course, limiting unnecessary commutes reduces single vehicle emissions. So in the US, the American Federation of Government Employees, that's one of the unions that represents federal workers there, is using this environmental framing or messaging in its campaign to secure work from home. The Biden administration has committed to the federal government to get to net zero by some such date. The date escapes me, but the union has basically latched on to this to say, well, here's an opportunity to reduce the federal government's carbon footprint, give federal workers the right to work from home. Not a bad rhetorical strategy. There are, however, some issues related to transit use and funding of public transit that this environmental framing raises, which people might want to keep in mind. There is a strong relationship, that is a negative correlation between transit ridership on the one hand and working from home. So of course, as working from home goes up, transit ridership goes down. We saw that during the pandemic, and many municipal public transit systems haven't fully recovered from that. So that's something to keep in mind, but it certainly doesn't negate the environmental benefit of having greater numbers of people working from home and not commuting. And then last, perhaps most important in terms of what I think is most convincing about telework rights, is that the fight over remote work pits management desire for control against workers' struggle for autonomy. A telework campaign really has really kind of puts the opportunity of increasing workers' autonomy on the table. Through winning a right to remote work, workers seek to limit management's ability to control the structure and pace of work, to surveil and monitor their performance, and to impose sanctions on workers it determines to be in some way inefficient. It really is about enhancing workers' autonomy, which is of course why management tends to resist it so vociferously. The pandemic and remote work in many ways generated a sense of panic among managers, or what you might call the managerial class. And increasingly that involved invasive software, or what came to be called bossware, that was deployed to monitor workers, do things like track their keystrokes. Some people went even so far as to implement software that video records workers, tracks their screen time, those types of things. And by some measures, the number and length of meetings even dramatically increased as a way for managers to kind of check in and keep track of what workers were doing. So all of these things, I think, need to also be borne in mind when fighting for telework rights, because again, it points to this issue of not just thinking about it as something that you win as a right, but something that you need to also shape as a right. If you're going to negotiate over telework, it needs to include a range of things, a range of protections for workers at the same time. So remote work during, before, and since the pandemic has been highly uneven across the working class, as I mentioned at the outset. Relatedly, unions' ability to secure telework rights or even commitments from employers so far to explore work from home options has been concentrated mostly among workers with enough structural power to impose this on employers. We're just beginning really to see a kind of uptick in a collective fight for telework rights, that really workers organizing around this issue and trying to put it on the table. So securing a right to telework is important, not only because it could limit management's right to dictate the place where work takes place, but because bargaining over telework opens the space for unions and workers to shape what exactly working from home could look like. As I mentioned, it's not just that it's important to win as a right for the sake of being able to work from home, but also because it opens the opportunity for unions to negotiate the terms of telework overall. And I think that's something that really needs to be emphasized and borne in mind in developing any telework rights campaign. So I'll leave it there for now, and we can do Q&A.
Right on. Thanks so much, Adam. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of potential questions here. I have a few myself, but I'm going to open it up to the crowd right now just to jump in. And again, on peut faire ça bilinguement. S'il y a quelqu'un qui préfère poser leur question en français, je peux traduire s'il y a des problèmes de compréhension. But yeah, we can do this bilingually if need be. But yeah, that was a great presentation, and I think people will probably have some conversation starters. So go ahead, folks. Just raise your hand or start speaking. We've got a summer crowd here. Lily, go ahead.
Thanks, Dr. Grant. I really appreciate hearing through the whole the piece about telework and what it could mean for us. I'm really curious about two things. One is the employer's legal responsibility to provide a safe working environment, which, since we've swept all the COVID protocols under the carpet, is not what they're providing, and the intersection with disability rights there, because most people who already have a disability are more likely to be severely impacted by COVID. And the data just keeps coming out, peer-reviewed studies almost every day coming out of places like the UK, showing that this can cause long-term disability, cognitive decline, etc. So I'm curious about that piece, just because I know that we're not really talking about it anymore, and I'm hopeful to hear more about it. And the other thing I'm curious about is, as we look to try and shape what telework could look like in the future, are we considering like the psychological side of that need to maintain power, and also, I guess, the fact that most of the power is held in the public service, even though we have parity, say, at the ministerial level, by white males. So I'm just curious, like, if you've thought about the dimension of how to turn that on its head and fight against someone who has very little incentive to give up any of that power to workers. Thanks.
Nate, did you want to take several, or we want to do one at a time?
I think we can go one at a time.
Okay, sure. So I think you raise a really good point about, the employer's obligation to provide a safe working environment and the continued threat of COVID, especially for people who are immunocompromised. There isn't, from what I've seen, this hasn't really been tested all that much before Labor Board. So we don't have a lot of precedent at this point. I think it's reasonable to assume that obligations around accommodation, disability accommodation, would likely cover this. An employer would have to provide work from home options for someone who is immunocompromised. But again, like I agree that the risks still posed by COVID are broader than perhaps would be interpreted by board to justify telework, continued telework arrangement for someone in that situation. So it's all the more reason to organize around this and really put it on the table as something that's important in and of itself. Yeah, I mean, again, until we see some more of these cases come before board, we won't really know. But I think, we saw some promising signs around the vaccine stuff, right? I mean, they basically, sent those people who were trying to not get vaccinated and claim some sort of discrimination at the board lost every time they tried. So, I mean, that was a good sign in the sense of protecting workplace safety as a higher priority. But yeah, in terms of accommodations, I would assume that accommodations would cover those things. But until we see some cases, I guess we don't know. The second part of your question, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what to say about that other than yes. Any campaign to win more rights for workers or to put new rights into a collective bargaining agreement, I think opens those opportunities to kind of rebalance the scales at a particular workplace. And it's also important as a mobilizing tactic or mobilizing rhetoric as well. If you have a situation where power is concentrated in a particular way, concentrated mostly, I'm sure, among white men at the top, that's a good mobilizing strategy to point those things out if you have a diverse workplace and if management is really not representative of the workforce that they're managing in that way.
Thanks.
Ian, just before, I just wanted to jump in on that too. I think really excellent points as usual. One thing I just want to pull from, this is more maybe speaking more to the people who are members of CAPE than Adam specifically, but we just had Adam, just for context, we had a national meeting on our defense fund. Why do we have a defense fund? That's our strike fund, which has recently been kind of gutted. But the kind of conversation really drifted into what type of bargaining we want to do. And as people will know, we have two paths we can choose at the start of bargaining in the federal public sector, one of which is the arbitration route, which means we forfeit our right to strike, and one of which is the strike conciliation route, which means that we don't forfeit our right to strike and have potentially more leverage in that way. But one big thing that came out of that was you're not going to gain new rights through the arbitration route. Just by definition, the labor board will never, the mediator, the arbitrator can't give you new rights in an arbitration. And so I guess you looking at the landscape, Adam, of the various demands here for work from home, for telework, provisions in CAs, and then kind of anticipating the future of how people are actually going to win these. Is it going to take strikes themselves? What do you think is the likely outcome, I think, in terms of us mobilizing a lot for a fight and then it ending up in a bargaining conflict? Because we can fight without bargaining too. We can do other things in the workplace to defend ourselves and push back and demand telework, but bargaining is kind of one of those big key moments of struggle that does get new rights established in writing. So I'm I guess to build on that question, what does it take to win these new rights?
Yeah, well, it takes an engaged membership, and what Jane McAlevey, the labor researcher and organizer, would call supermajority support. I think that will be 100% necessary, especially win new rights in general, but a right like telework, which really does, as I tried to highlight, enhance worker autonomy and really does cut against management's unilateral right to determine where and how work takes place. It is a big potential big win, so it requires a lot of mobilization. And I didn't know that about the initial two paths of your sort of bargaining, how that works. So yeah, the arbitration route, absolutely. New rights will not be won through arbitration. Arbitration is classically a kind of middle of the road solution. Arbitrators are famous for just taking the middle position, and then that's it. You're seeing that actually right now a lot coming out with new wage decisions. So since PSAC settled, that has become the more or less the standard. So workers who are out there demanding, cost of living adjustments in line with inflation are getting something closer to what PSAC got in their arbitration. They're getting something close to what PSAC got precisely because of this. So that's one other thing to keep in mind. If a telework campaign that either secures it through bargaining or secures it through striking is successful, it sets an important precedent if it's a federal public sector union, because arbitrators look to the federal public service as an example when they're making decisions across the country. So
great, thanks. Ian, why don't you go ahead and ask?
Thank you, Nate, and thank you, Dr. King. This is a great presentation. I really enjoyed it, and Lily, that was a great question as well. I'm not sure if I have a question per se, so I'm just going to kind of share my thoughts and attempt to kind of get at what I'm trying to get at. what I guess the issue I've experienced is that it almost feels like we're arguing with someone who kind of changes the argument as the discussion evolves. We talk about, oh, you need to be able to fully fulfill the obligations of your job, right? And in my experience, I work in ESTC employment. We kind of flag barriers that are hindering that ability. And I have ADHD, so it's a bit of a different story. I tried to go through kind of the we'll call it formal, maybe not formal, maybe a collegial collaborative approach where I raised the issues, nothing really happened. And then over time, I eventually submitted a request for accommodation, which did go well. It's just that Lily pointed out, like the people you tend to be trying to get approval from are, generally straight white people with families who are older, so it's like they can't really relate to like the I've got a 2.5-year-old, so it's kind of like the challenges of like already having ADHD and not even being aware of the impacts that the office setting had on me before. But it led to me having to probably share way more than I had to, that I legally had to, because it was getting the what about before the pandemic type thing. So I guess like in the absence of clarity, where there's some sort of like ambiguity, you've got some managers who are insisting that they need to get absolute clarity from the higher ups, and then that generally doesn't go well. And then you've got the managers who do trust their staff and have a good relationship with the director, who probably has a good relationship with the director general, and then they're trusting their staff, and that seems to be going well. But it's like the Wild West out here. And for me, like with the ADHD, I have a lot of people come to me and ask, because they know they have a telework agreement, about like, I know we're talking here like collectively, but on an individual basis, like presentation was fantastic. A lot of the things resonated. It's hard to maybe take from it that there's many current in the short term kind of actionable items that like someone else could do, to try to like move things forward, because like I said, we're arguing with someone who just changes the argument, right? So I'm not sure if there's a question there or if there's a comment from someone else to try to make sense of my like a little tangent. But I am curious, like from a non-perspective of somebody without a disability, as well as somebody with one, like I received like a year agreement, even though like my ADHD isn't going away type thing. But it was like at the time it was kind of like, well, and to be honest, I recognize that this was a win, based on like the current corporate environment that I've been in the government for like 10 years. But anyway, I'll stop talking now, and I hope this was a waste of our time.
No, that was very interesting to hear.
Do you mind if I just jump in from a local president's perspective, what Ian just said? It's quick. Ian, I just want to say like that resonates with a lot of the cases, especially for kind of neuroatypical people who were asked for accommodations because they realized that like working from home opened up a world of productivity and didn't actively disable them in the same way that being in like a kind of like crowded office environment did. I would say though, like the common thing of people getting a year telework agreement, even though they've got things that are not about to vanish in a year, is super common and whatnot. And it just shows that the employer wants to kick the can down the road. But we are encouraging everybody, especially if kind of like they're in the realm of undiagnosed disabilities, not just especially, but even if they're in the realm of undiagnosed quote unquote disabilities, and if they've got accommodation needs that are functional, that are directly related to this, like let's push as hard as we can in the kind of duty to accommodate space that we're confined to right now and try to maximize what we can get. But more on that later, and Adam, I'll let you respond to his broader points.
No, that was really great, and I think that's super important, right? Is to maximize the space where you can fight now. Right, and around duty to accommodate is a good one. When Nate was originally sending me stuff before this, just kind of info on what's going on, he sent a bunch of stuff around the internal review panels and the plan to kind of try and get rank and file members in there on those panels, and to kind of to shape what they sort of do and how they operate. I think that's also really important. So just on that general point, a lot of the stuff I raised is probably sort of more longer term in terms of an ongoing campaign that seeks to secure telework rights permanently. But plenty of things to do, and you guys of course would probably know more than me about that, of immediate actionable items that could be done now.
Great. Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for this. I thought it was really helpful. It's definitely useful to see what can be learned from sort of like other struggles and what's been achieved in other workplaces. We're often really focused on our own, so it's good to keep that larger perspective, insight and learn from what others do. I know that you mentioned like a couple times that really to make these new gains, like it involves like the employer giving up autonomy to workers, and so they're not going to do that very easily. And so it seems like we need a lot of organized pressure to really make those kinds of gains. I know unions in general are kind of struggling with, they're not used to how to work in sort of distributed workplaces and all that kind of stuff. And that's something that I think we're all learning from. But curious, just from your observations on all the different struggles that you looked at, is there any kind of lessons learned that you saw in sort of like tactics or campaigns or things like that that seemed to kind of help make any kind of gains, or anything creative that you saw that we might be able to learn from?
I anticipated this question, Doug, and I feel bad because I don't have a lot to add on this, because that particular research project is kind of a stale one, in the sense that it is reviewing collective bargaining agreement language and not actually talking to any of the unions who are engaged in those things. It would be a great second step to that project to pick some campaigns and actually do some field work and interview people. So unfortunately, I don't have a ton to add to those. Although, I mean, the one thing, I guess, the one campaign that I can speak to, and it's not just around telework specifically, but around the organizing campaign. So I included language there from the IATSE local that organized that Titmos animation studio in BC. And that's a relatively new local. They won their certification during the pandemic and then negotiated their first contract, and the first contract included telework rights. That campaign, and again, as you sort of mentioned, a very distributed workforce. You already had people working in different locations. It's it's a kind of an artistic workforce, not your typical union membership. And again, the campaign really kind of showed that you can overcome those things with, outreach from organizers, routine communication, just strong organization and strong member engagement and mobilization. They were able to win some pretty impressive things in a first contract. Now, again, they're pretty high skilled workers in the sense of their skill set, but not your typical union members. And artists tend to be hard to organize sometimes, to be honest. And they were pretty successful. So, I mean, there's one case, I think, where it does show that, with good organizers working hard, member engagement, you can win some pretty impressive things. But I'm sorry, I don't have more specifics on the remote work campaigns in particular.
Okay, I think we have time for like one more question before I kind of start to wrap this up, and then talk about the campaign that the Solidarity Caucus is kind of like on its final stages of putting together. Does anybody else want to ask one more question? Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, yeah, just to give people kind of a heads up on where the Solidarity Caucus is going with this. So like obviously like CAPE has its own version of very long-term planning for an eventual RTO campaign that they got kind of mandated to do through a motion at last year's AGM, or sorry, a resolution at last year's AGM that was mainly focused on like the equity components and whatnot. And I think we're going for a broader, just like we want to fight for telework as a right, full stop campaign. And so right now, like we're looking at like a kind of like 5-staged, I guess, thing that we're going to do, which will start kind of with like ATIPs and information gathering, just getting info on the landscape. Then we're going to try to like push everybody to ask for a telework agreement, regardless of the kind of like DTA context of it. And that just gets those decisions in front of these new departmental panels. So we can have, and we get the written text of why decisions are being rejected from that. So we gain even more information that way, but it also gets people kind of like mobilized to ask for what they need. And we are willing to play pretty open interpretations of the duty to accommodate on there, not in a cynical way, but in a way that like people actually do need accommodation on things like childcare and things like that. The reason that people usually want telework. But one really important thing is that we're gonna have to fight hard to get our local elected officials on these panels and not our labor relations officers. I love a lot of our LROs. This isn't a swipe at them, but they do tend to take a more conservative, legalistic approach when we need an advocacy approach on these new departmental panels in our letter of agreement. So we're going to need to use an advocacy approach to actually mobilize people to want to fight for a new system. But in maxing out this new system, we're going to need that advocacy approach too. And then like out of that, we'll have enough information hopefully to put kind of problem branches on blast across the government and aim to kind of like measurably improve outcomes in those problem spots and like fight where the fight is very active on that. A lot of managers are willing to just give people telework agreements fairly loosely, but there's some real holdouts in a bunch of different, even just within ISED, there's real holdouts across even just my sector, where managers are absolutely rock solid, never going to bend on a telework thing, and we'll fight people all the way to the highest levels to make sure that people are denied their telework rights. And then so like that's contained to this system campaign that we're using to be able to like basically mobilize a strong base so that we can get a serious kind of like super majority, like Adam was saying, power built up for the next round of bargaining where we are actually going to win these rights. And we're hoping to fight to win these rights within the next round of bargaining. But it's going to take a fairly mobilized and fairly active union to be able to do that. We're not going to win this in the courts. We're not going to win this in arbitration. We're going to have to actually fight for these rights. But I just want to give you a heads up that like the steering committee of the Solidarity Caucus is putting together all the notes and everything from the campaign discussion that we just had with all the members of the Solidarity Caucus. Again, I would really recommend that people get involved in the Solidarity Caucus if they want to be involved in these conversations, if you're not already. Again, I'll put the hyperlink in the chat to fill out the form and join up. Everyone's welcome across departments and everything. It's one of the better spaces to have a real campaign conversation in Cape right now. But yeah, that's all I had for now. Adam, thank you so much for making some space to talk about this. I think you really kind of like streamlined a lot of our thinking on this. Are we able to get the deck from you that you put together?
Sure.
This deck, Adam? Great. And does anybody have any kind of closing comments before we wrap here?
I don't mind jumping in really quickly. I really appreciated hearing all of the different dimensions that we should be considering. And I think especially the fact that there's going to be so much work on shaping what we actually want this to look like in the future, because it's not just about winning the right. It's actually about creating, I guess, kind of the future that we want to see for everybody within the unions. And I hope that we get there. So thanks for helping us along.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It was really great to be with you guys today. And
Yeah.
very cool to hear about what you're doing so far.
And we'll keep in touch about like how this fight goes and where we end up. Maybe you
Absolutely.
can use it at some point in the class struggle bulletin.
Yeah, I'd love it. Yeah.
Okay. Again, Adam, really appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your thoughts. Very helpful. And we're gonna stay in touch moving forward.
Great. See you guys.
Bye, everyone.